story Susan Willis Fletcher told about herself, and told very well, was the story of an innocent woman so confident in her own vindication that she crossed an entire ocean twice to make sure a British jury heard it. Most swindlers run, and run quickly. When the law finally closes in, the sensible ones take whatever they can carry and disappear across whatever border still offers them safety. Susan Willis Fletcher did the exact opposite of what any prudent, guilty person would have done. Arrested once already in America, watching the case against her collapse, the moment her accuser sailed home to England, she did not stay where she was safe. She boarded a ship herself, crossed the Atlantic in the other direction, and walked directly into the country where a formal charge was waiting for her, apparently certain that once a proper English court heard her side of it, she would be cleared entirely and sent home with her reputation restored. She was not cleared, and the gap between the story Susan Willis Fletcher told about her own innocence, told with total and apparently genuine conviction, and the verdict a jury actually returned after weighing the evidence in full, is the whole of what this case has to teach us. Tonight we revisit one case built entirely on that gap, on the difference between the confident public performance of a wronged woman and the far more troubling private reality a courtroom eventually forced into the light. One celebrated society medium, one wealthy widow persuaded to hand over a fortune in jewels through nothing more than the force of a trusted voice in a darkened room, and one extraordinary decision to sail home and fight a charge that a smarter, guiltier woman would simply have let lie. The case of Susan Willis Fletcher begins in the fashionable spiritualist circles of Victorian London, in the years when the movement's fascination with mediums who could commune with the dead had reached the very height of its social respectability. By the late 1870s, Susan Willis Fletcher had established herself as one of the more celebrated mediums working in the London season, a woman trusted by a genuine and often wealthy clientele to provide access to a world the grieving and the curious desperately wanted to believe was still reachable. Spiritualism, as this channel has explored before in the cases of Florence Cook and others who worked this same trade in this same city, was never a fringe curiosity in this period. It moved through drawing rooms and country houses with the same easy social currency as any other fashionable pursuit, and a medium with a strong reputation among the right circles could find herself trusted with confidences and eventually with fortunes that few other professions of the era would ever have granted a woman working largely on her own account. Consider what it actually meant for a woman to build a professional reputation as a medium in this specific stratum of late Victorian London society, because the position required a peculiar and demanding combination of skills. A successful medium needed the social polish to move comfortably through drawing rooms that would never have admitted her on the strength of birth alone. The psychological acuity to read a grieving or curious client closely enough to produce messages that felt genuinely, uncannily personal, and the sheer performative stamina to sustain that impression, séance after séance, client after client, without a single visible crack in the presentation. It was, in its own way, one of the very few professions available to a Victorian woman in which talent, charisma, and nerve could translate directly into real income and real social access, entirely independent of the family connections or inherited wealth that governed almost every other avenue open to women of the era. That the same skills could be turned toward outright exploitation rather than genuine spiritual comfort was a risk built into the profession from its very foundations. Among the women drawn into Fletcher's circle was Juliet Ann Theodora Hurtley Rickard Hart-Davis, a woman of substantial personal wealth who came to trust Susan Willis Fletcher with something considerably more valuable than an afternoon's entertainment. She came to trust her over time with jewels and other valuables amounting, by the final accounting, to somewhere between £6,000 and £10,000, a genuinely enormous sum, extracted not through any single dramatic theft, but through the slow, patient accumulation of what the courts would eventually describe as undue influence. I want you to sit with that specific legal language for a moment, because it tells you something important about how this fraud actually operated. Undue influence is not the language of a simple confidence trick, a lie told once and profited from immediately. It describes a relationship built carefully over time, in which one person's judgment and free will are gradually, deliberately eroded by another's psychological dominance, until decisions that would once have seemed impossible, handing over one's own family jewels to a spiritualist confidant, come to feel, to the person making them, like the natural and even wise conclusion of a trusted relationship. That is a far slower and far more demanding kind of fraud than an ordinary swindle. It requires the confidence artist to sustain, month after month, the performance of intimacy and spiritual authority, convincing enough that a genuinely wealthy, presumably intelligent woman would come to see the surrender of a fortune as simply what a devoted believer does for her medium. I want you to sit with what made this particular relationship such fertile ground for that kind of gradual capture. The spiritualist medium occupied a position of intimacy that few other relationships in Victorian society could match. She was not merely a social acquaintance or a paid professional in the ordinary sense. She was, to a genuine believer, the sole reliable conduit to a lost husband, a dead child, a departed parent, carrying an emotional authority that a lawyer, a banker, or even a clergyman could rarely command over the same person. A widow like Mrs. Hart-Davis, drawn into that relationship by genuine grief or genuine spiritual curiosity, was placing her trust not in a stranger asking for money, but in the one person who seemed to hold open a door to everyone she had already lost. Against that kind of emotional leverage, the ordinary caution a person might apply to any other financial request could dissolve almost without her noticing it happening at all. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now back to the record. We do not have, in the surviving record, the full and intimate detail of exactly how Susan Willis Fletcher built that particular hold over Mrs. Hart-Davis, the specific séances, the specific spirit messages, the specific moments in which a widow's grief or loneliness or genuine spiritual conviction was gently steered toward the conclusion that her jewels were safer or more spiritually useful, in her medium's keeping than in her own. That gap in the record is in its own way instructive. The most effective long cons of this kind rarely leave behind the single damning letter or the single incriminating receipt that a courtroom can point to directly. They leave behind only an outcome, a fortune moved from one hand to another, and a relationship that, viewed from the outside after the fact, looks nothing at all like the ordinary friendship it was designed to resemble while it was still unfolding. What the record does preserve with total clarity is the outcome. By the summer of 1880, Fletcher had in her possession a fortune in jewels and clothing that had once belonged to Mrs. Hart-Davis, obtained through a relationship that the law would ultimately determine had crossed the line from genuine spiritual counsel into calculated financial exploitation. Pause here is where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn, and I want you to stay with it, because the choices Susan Willis Fletcher made once the accusation surfaced are as revealing as the fraud itself. In the summer of 1880, Fletcher was in the United States visiting her mother when she was arrested there on the charge of having obtained Mrs. Hart-Davis's jewels and valuables by undue influence or false pretenses. It should, by any ordinary logic, have been the end of the matter as far as any British prosecution was concerned. She was on American soil, facing an American arrest, with an ocean between herself and the country where the alleged fraud had actually taken place. And then the case against her, on American ground, simply dissolved because Mrs. Hart-Davis herself left the country and sailed back to England before the matter could ever come to trial there. If this account is holding you the way it holds me, stay with it, because what Susan Willis Fletcher did next is the detail that has kept this case alive in the historical record for a century and a half. She did not stay in America, safely out of reach of any British court, with her mother's household and an ocean between herself and any English magistrate. She crossed the Atlantic herself, sailing directly into England, into the jurisdiction where the formal charges against her were still very much alive, and she did so, by every surviving account, with genuine confidence that a proper trial would establish her innocence beyond doubt. Consider what that decision actually required of her. She was choosing to walk directly into a courtroom, in the country where her accuser lived, where the evidence of the alleged fraud had actually been generated, in order to clear a name she insisted did not need clearing at all. It is, among the confidence artists this channel has covered, one of the boldest and strangest gambles on record, a woman betting her own liberty on the conviction that the full truth, properly heard, would vindicate her completely, weigh the calculation she must have made before boarding that ship. She had, by that point, watched the American case against her collapse entirely, dismissed not on the strength of her innocence, but on the simple, practical grounds that her accuser had left the country. She could, quite easily, have treated that dismissal as the end of the matter, remained in America near her mother, and allowed an ocean and a jurisdictional technicality to do the work that a full defense of her actions might never have accomplished. Instead, she chose the harder path. Every plausible explanation for that choice tells you something different about who she actually was. Perhaps she believed, with total sincerity, that Mrs. Hart-Davis's gifts had been freely and knowingly given, and that any fair hearing would establish exactly that. Perhaps she understood that an unresolved charge hanging over her in England would eventually poison her reputation and her livelihood far more thoroughly than a decisive trial, win or lose, ever could. Or perhaps, and this is the reading that troubles me most, she had spent so many years successfully persuading grieving and vulnerable people of things that were not true that she had lost the ability to accurately judge when her own persuasive gifts would, and would not, be sufficient to carry the day. A skill practiced long and successfully enough, whatever its original purpose, has a way of becoming the lens through which its owner sees every subsequent problem, including the problem of her own defense. The trial that followed drew wide and genuine international attention, covered extensively in both the spiritualist press, which largely rallied to Fletcher's defense, and in the wider mainstream newspapers, which treated the case as a genuine sensation, to celebrated medium fighting to clear her name against the word of a wealthy widow who claimed to have been systematically fleeced. The split in coverage tells you almost everything about how deeply this case cut into the wider argument raging across Victorian society over spiritualism itself. To the movement's believers, reported in its own dedicated press, Fletcher was not merely an individual defendant. She was a stand-in for the entire spiritualist cause, and her prosecution read, to many of them, as one more skirmish in a longer campaign of establishment hostility toward a movement that respectable science and respectable religion alike had never fully accepted. To the mainstream newspapers writing for a wider and more skeptical readership, the case offered something rather different, a satisfying confirmation of exactly the suspicions many had long held about the entire trade in spirit communication, dressed up in the irresistible particulars of jewels, betrayal, and a bold transatlantic gamble. Susan Willis Fletcher walked into that courtroom carrying the weight of an argument that was never, in truth, only about her. The proceedings examined in detail the nature of the relationship between the two women, the pattern of gifts and transfers that had moved the jewels from Mrs. Hart-Davis's possession into Fletcher's, and the question at the very center of the whole case, whether that pattern represented genuine, freely given generosity from a grateful spiritualist patron, or the slow, calculated harvest of a vulnerable widow's fortune by a woman who had learned exactly how to cultivate and exploit that vulnerability. The jury did not find in Susan Willis Fletcher's favor. Having heard the evidence set out in full, the pattern of gifts, the value of what had actually changed hands, the relationship that had made such a transfer feel natural rather than alarming to the woman giving it, they returned a verdict of guilt on 3 separate charges connected to the case. The court sentenced her to 12 months' imprisonment. Think about the specific shape of that outcome, because it is the whole irony this case turns upon. Susan Willis Fletcher had made an extraordinary, very public wager that a full and open trial would establish her complete innocence, confident enough in that outcome to sail voluntarily into the exact jurisdiction where she was most exposed. The trial she had actively sought, rather than the charge she might simply have waited out from the safety of America, produced instead a formal, courtroom-tested confirmation of guilt. Her own confidence, the very quality that had presumably made her so effective a medium in the first place, the ability to project total conviction in a claim that could not actually be independently verified, may have led her to fatally misjudge how a British jury, hearing the full evidence laid out in cold daylight rather than filtered through the trust of an ongoing séance relationship, would actually receive her story. Fletcher served her sentence, and in 1884 she published a memoir of the experience, titled 12 Months in an English Prison, presenting her account of the trial, the conviction, and her time in custody to a public that remained, in some quarters at least, sympathetic to her version of events, even after the jury's verdict. The book found a real audience, particularly among believers within the wider spiritualist movement, who continued to view her prosecution as, at minimum, unfair, and at most, an outright persecution of a genuine medium by a legal and social establishment deeply hostile to spiritualism as a whole. A memoir written from inside that specific position, a convicted woman addressing a sympathetic readership already primed to believe the conviction itself was the true injustice, is a fascinating document to sit with because it is never simply a neutral record of events. Every page of 12 Months in an English Prison was written by a woman who understood her audience intimately, who knew exactly which details would confirm her readers' existing suspicion of a biased legal system, and which would reinforce their sense of her as a wronged and dignified victim of persecution rather than a convicted fraudster serving a lawful sentence. Whether or not a single word of it was strictly accurate, it succeeded, by any reasonable measure, in exactly the task it was written for, keeping a substantial portion of public sympathy on Fletcher's side, long after a jury under oath had already reached the opposite conclusion. consider what that continued sympathy actually reveals, because it mirrors something we have seen elsewhere in this series. A conviction delivered by a jury after a full and genuinely contested trial did not settle the matter for everyone who followed the case. Fletcher's own account of her innocence, published in her own words in her own book, continued to circulate and continued to find believers precisely because a compelling personal narrative, told with sufficient confidence and sufficient detail, can survive a legal verdict in the court of public opinion, even when it could not survive the more exacting standard of a court of law. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals how completely the spiritualist movement's own internal culture of trust could be weaponized against exactly the women who had the most to lose within it, and it reveals, too, how badly equipped the legal apparatus of the era was to address a fraud that unfolded gradually, rather than in a single provable transaction. Consider the specific evidentiary problem this case posed to the court trying it. An ordinary theft has a clean, discreet moment, an object taken without permission, a lie told to secure a single payment, a forged signature on a single document. What Susan Willis Fletcher was accused of doing to Mrs. Hart-Davis had no such clean moment. It was, by its very nature, a fraud assembled from dozens of individually defensible transactions, a gift here, a loan there, a jewel handed over after a particularly moving séance, each one capable of being described honestly as a voluntary act of generosity by the woman who gave it. Proving undue influence required the court to look past every single one of those individually reasonable moments and establish, to the satisfaction of a jury, that the pattern they formed together amounted to exploitation rather than genuine friendship. That the prosecution succeeded in making that case is itself a measure of how thoroughly the pattern, once laid out in full, must have overwhelmed any innocent explanation Fletcher's defense could offer. Mrs. Hart-Davis was not, by any account, an unintelligent or naive woman in any general sense. She was a woman of substantial means who had, within the specific closed and emotionally intense world of an ongoing spiritualist relationship, gradually surrendered judgment that she would very likely have exercised with total clarity in any ordinary commercial transaction. The undue influence the law eventually found was not built through a single dramatic lie. It was built through the accumulated weight of dozens or hundreds of smaller moments of trust, each one reasonable in isolation, each one drawing the relationship a little further from an ordinary friendship and a little closer to the kind of psychological dependency a skilled and patient manipulator could eventually turn to substantial financial account. Compare Fletcher's method for a moment against the other frauds this series has already traced, because the contrast is instructive. Annie Gordon Bailey needed only weeks to extract a promise and vanish. Madame Rachel worked her fraud on Mary Borrowdale across months of drip-fed hope. Susan Willis Fletcher's relationship with Mrs. Hart-Davis appears to have unfolded across a genuinely extended period, likely years rather than months, sustained not by any single dramatic lie, but by the steady, ongoing performance of spiritual authority a working medium had to maintain across every single sitting. That patience is itself a kind of professional discipline, the willingness to forego a quick, smaller theft in favor of a slower, far larger one, extracted a little at a time from a relationship built to look. Every individual moment, like nothing more than devotion freely given between two women who trusted one another completely, there is a second observation worth sitting with about Fletcher's own remarkable choice to face her accusers rather than evade them. It would be easy to read her decision to return to England as evidence of genuine innocence. the natural instinct of a wrongly accused woman determined to clear her name, but it is equally possible to read it as the final, boldest performance of a woman whose entire career had been built on the ability to project total, unwavering conviction, regardless of the underlying truth, a skill so deeply practiced that it may have convinced her, as much as it had once convinced Mrs. Hart-Davis, that sheer confidence alone would be sufficient to carry the day in front of a jury, as it had so often carried the day in front of a séance circle. The jury, weighing actual evidence rather than the atmosphere of a darkened room, was not moved the same way. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I would genuinely like to read your thoughts on it in the comments below, because this is the one case in this series where I am genuinely uncertain which answer I believe. Susan Willis Fletcher made a choice almost no guilty person makes, walking voluntarily into the jurisdiction and the courtroom best positioned to convict her, apparently certain of her own vindication. Does that choice suggest a woman who genuinely believed on some level in her own innocence, however the law ultimately judged the facts? Or does it suggest something more unsettling? Con artist so thoroughly practiced at persuading others that she had, in some sense, come to persuade herself as well, walking into that Old Bailey courtroom with the same total, unshakable confidence she had once used to convince a grieving widow to hand over a fortune in jewels. The spiritualist circles that once made Susan Willis Fletcher one of London's most trusted mediums have long since faded. From the fashionable prominence they held in the 1870s and 1880s, the movement itself gradually eclipsed by new intellectual fashions and the slow, steady advance of a more skeptical age. The record of her case remains in the trial coverage that once filled newspaper columns on both sides of the Atlantic, and in her own memoir, still readable today in libraries and archives that have preserved it. A document in which a convicted fraudster tells, in her own confident voice, the story of her own innocence, unbothered, or at least undeterred, by the jury that had already told a very different and far less flattering story about her under oath. This case closes this particular run of the series on a slightly different note than the ones before it, because it is the only one in this batch where the swindler herself left us her own extended, first-person account of events, published, read and believed by a real audience even after a jury had already ruled against her. Every other woman in this series speaks to us only through court records, newspaper columns, and the occasional surviving letter. Susan Willis Fletcher speaks to us in her own words, at length defending herself still, and that fact alone should make us read every claim of victimhood in this entire genre a little more carefully, because the confidence that built the original fraud did not vanish the moment the jury delivered its verdict. It simply found a new form to work in. That is, in the end, the quiet warning underneath every single case this series has told so far. A conviction closes a legal file. It does not and cannot force a confident enough voice to stop telling its own version of events, and it does not force a sympathetic enough audience to stop wanting to believe that version over the one a jury actually returned. The long con, in its truest and most durable form, does not end at the prison gate. It simply changes its medium from a séance room or a Bond Street salon to the printed page of a memoir, and waits patiently for a new audience willing to extend one more time the very trust that a courtroom had already proven should never have been given. Her name was Susan Willis Fletcher, a medium who built a genuine and celebrated London reputation on the strength of a trust she would ultimately be found, by a jury under oath, to have exploited for a fortune in jewels and clothing belonging to a widow who believed for far too long that she was dealing with a genuine and devoted friend. she made the extraordinary choice to sail toward her own prosecution rather than away from it, confident that the full truth would set her free, and instead found herself convicted on 3 separate charges on the very evidence she had been so certain would clear her. Somewhere between the ocean she crossed to prove her innocence, and the 12 months she served for the opposite finding is the exact measure of how far unwavering personal conviction can carry a story, and precisely where, in front of a jury weighing actual evidence rather than the atmosphere of a trusted séance, that conviction finally and quite decisively runs out of road.